Great. I'm Professor Green, and this is part 2 of 3 sets for chapter 1 of our textbook in international business. And so there are 2 macro factors when we talk about greater globalization. How does globalization actually improve or change? The first one is the decline in barriers to free flow of goods, services, and capitals, as we mentioned. So if there are less tariffs, if there are cultural issues that are overcome, et cetera, then we are allowed to transportation, et cetera, then we're able to much more easily grow globalization. And the other one is technological change, which you mentioned already, right? Microprocessors and the internet are a big part of that. Let's go ahead and get into it. So international trade occurs when a firm exports goods or services to consumers in a different country, just to clarify that. And then foreign direct investment occurs when a firm invests resources in business activities outside of its own home country. So, for example, when we open up a new McDonald's in a country outside of America. During the 19s and 20s, many nations put up barriers to international trade to protect domestic industry. But now, after World War II, the idea was totally different. Advanced countries tried to reduce barriers, and that's why we saw things like the GATT, WTO, the Uruguay round, which was from 1993, that moved forward these ideas of globalization and the WTO, as I mentioned. So setting up policies to help monitor and regulate international trade. Before we get into table 1.1, a side note is right where I went to business school at Thunderbird, known exclusively for international business. It was set up exactly after World War II because a pilot came home from being abroad and he decided that globalization was the way to go. And he wanted to set up a school. I was set up on the Air Force Base in Arizona called Thunderbird. That's where the name of the school came from. And he decided that it was just so important for the movement of society going forward to have international business. So no surprise that one of the top schools the top school for international business was set up after World War II. So here we are, table 1.1, average tariff rates on manufactured products as percentage of value. So just to show you, right, in 1913, that France, had, or 21%, the United States had 44% of products manufactured within their countries. Then it started to decrease in 1950, right after World War II, focusing on the United States, really quickly to 14, down to 5.7. And now in 2018, only 3.1% of products that are sold in the United States are manufactured within the United States. So declining trade and investment barriers continue. Trades in goods and services has been growing faster than the world output for decades. So we're going to look at a graph in just a minute, and it'll show you that total trade is much bigger than the total world GDP, the world output. That in 2019, sales of foreign affiliates of multinational corporations reached $27 trillion. And the implications of this really fast-paced volume of world trade means more companies are dispersing parts for production. Economies of nation states becoming intertwined, right? So it's, as I said, it's not just having all of our products from the same country. As I have a shirt from China, I have a car from Germany, etc. The world is becoming significant, and at the same time, the world is becoming significantly wealthier. So that's a good thing, right? We're able to produce more money because we're able to enter more markets and have more trade. So it's all a good thing, right? Thunderbird was onto the right idea. So this graph, I think, is super interesting. It shows the value of world merchandise trade and world production from 1960 to 2019. And so here we have the world GDP index. So as you can see, yes, of course, the GDP is slowly climbing into 2020. But the merchandise trade index, this is what I was talking about on the previous slide, the total amount of value of goods moving back and forth across borders is now much, much higher than the total GDP of the world, right? And yes, there was a drop here in 2008 for the financial crisis, but as a whole, it's just getting bigger and bigger. And my perspective, that's a good thing. So what are these further drivers of globalization? Some firms are finding home markets under attack from foreign competitors, right? So that goes back to, let's talk about Pennsylvania and Pittsburgh and the steel mills, right? Most of our 99% of our steel now is made in China. There was, as I said, a global financial crisis of 2008, and there was a drop in global output that led to more calls for trade barriers to protect jobs at home. And that resulted in some trade wars, right, between the US and China, setting up these tariffs. And that may slow the rate of globalization and production. But as the author of the textbook says, and how I agree, that we can't push away globalization, right? Even though we'll set up some tariffs and we'll say that we need to protect some industries at home, things are going to be moving forward no matter what. And just we want to note here that COVID-19 has a significant impact on global supply chain and thus on globalization. So it did slow things down, as we saw in the previous slide, but it is now continuing to pick back up. The second piece of globalization, what pushes globalization forward, is this technology change and its communications. So here we see that since World War II, microprocessors, right, created an explosive growth of high power, low cost computing. And the textbook talks a lot about the power of these microprocessors. It says that microprocessors also advanced telecommunications, and that there's a Moore's law here, which I thought was interesting. As the cost of microprocessors fall, their power increases. And actually, as their power, they say as their power doubles, the cost of production falls in half every 18 months. So this just means the author of the textbook is trying to tell us that, in his opinion, right, we can't hide from globalization because the technology is moving us forward no matter what. Computers are getting faster, as we can see with, trading on the stock market. It's all automated, medical records happening much more faster than we've ever seen, et cetera, et cetera. Phones getting faster. My toddler 4-year-old can YouTube like a pro, right? So we can't avoid the movement forward of society and of globalization because the technology is moving forward so quickly. We also have the internet, as I mentioned earlier in this chapter, 4.5 billion users, 58% of the global population. Isn't that interesting? It's like only 60%, obviously in this country, it's like much higher than that, but, in developing countries, they don't always have access to internet. It reduces the constraints of location, scale, and time zones, as we can see between email and making phone calls via the internet, et cetera, making everything a whole lot easier. Then also we can't help but talk about transportation technology too, right? Commercial jets, super freighters, right? It's so fun to go down to Long Beach, right? It's the biggest port in the world, actually, because we have all these things coming in from Asia. Huge ships, just going out to Playa del Rey and looking out, you continuously see these huge ships with these super freighters moving goods back and forth. There's also innovation of containerization. It's significantly lowered the shipping costs. So the implications for the globalization of production: lower transportation costs, make geographically dispersed production system more economical, right? Allows firms to better respond to demand shifts, which is really great. As they were saying at Dell, the example in the book, Dell Computers in Texas, they only have product in their warehouse for 3 days worth of inventory. If they need it, if there's a product that they ordered and it's going to be delivered in 4 days, they actually get that from someplace else because they are so confident that they can get that from a cheaper place much more, very, very quickly. The implications for globalizations of markets: Low-cost communication networks create electronic global marketplace. Low-cost transportation makes shipping products around the world more economical, right? Reduce cultural distance and converging customer tastes and preferences. So it sounds like, oh my gosh, right? Globalization, it's happening, it's fast, it's great, we're all on board. At the same time, we still need to study international business because there are still strong differences in culture and preferences and in business practices, right? And so we'll get into that in this course for sure. Another slide here, the changing demographics of the global economy. As we've also somewhat mentioned, like the early 1960s, the US dominated the world economy and world trade. The US dominated world direct foreign investment. The multinational enterprises dominated international business from the US. About half the world was off limits to Western international business, half the world, right? In fact, we're talking about Asia and China. They were communist and totally, sequestered, let's say, to within their own borders, but now they've opened up their borders. So today, much has changed. The US was also dominant in its industrial power, accounting for about 38% of world manufacturing output. But today, right, US accounts for only 24% of the world manufacturing output. Germany, France, and the UK had similar decline. Rapid economic growth now in countries like, as I mentioned, China, India, great education system that has allowed India to move forward, Russia until recently, and Brazil, right? So really great that to see Brazil slowly making their way forward. As we see also Brazil has a lot of issues when it comes to corruption that we'll talk about in chapter 2, but until yeah, they're continuing to baby steps, 3 steps forward, 2 steps back for Brazil, in my opinion. These 3 countries are sometimes known as called the BRIC countries, BRIC, right? Brazil, Russia, India, China, because they are the 4 countries to watch, they say, because they are moving forward now so quickly. And that, as you see here, Chinese economy could surpass the US within a decade. And there's further relative decline by the US and others. So the changing demographics of world output and world exports here. 1960, world output, 38% for the US, share of world output today, 24. And the share of world exports today, only 8.2. And you can see, right, China didn't even have any world output in 1960, but now it's growing quite significantly. Let's talk further about the changing demographics of the global economy. World output generated by developing countries has steadily increased since 1960, as I mentioned. The stock of FDI, the total cumulative value of foreign investments, is generated by rich industrial countries is declining. So more and more are other countries investing, but these rich companies like the United States, France, Germany, etc., the total value is declining, and we see increasing from obviously China and other developing countries. Cross-border flows of foreign direct investment is rising, right? And the largest developing country recipients of FDI now are China, Mexico, and Brazil. As I said, the countries to watch. So, and Mexico snuck in there into the BRIC countries. Let's look at this slide, the FDI outward stock as a percentage of GDP. So you can see here that from 1995 to 2019, that things are definitely increasing. But what is interesting is here that China in 1995, as I said, had nothing, right? Because they were totally only talking to themselves. But now, oh my goodness, in 2019, they're catching up very, very quickly to Japan and to the US and to the world, right? So again, just another visual as to how these developing countries are catching up to the developed. We also have a similar slide, I guess you'd say, just to show how developing countries overall, developing economies, are increasing and talking about FDI inflows. As you can see here, only a small percentage of the total, but now catching up. Everything's rising, yes, but now the developing countries are really taking a stakehold. And we haven't spoken about Africa, but I do have a good friend who just wrote a book called African, the country that can do things. And she has spent 2 decades working in Africa and just wanting to make it apparent to business leaders that there is a lot of opportunity in Africa, despite potential corruption of the past, that it too is a developing country that is going to be a continent of the future. So the changing nature of the M&Es is we'll talk about here. So the M&Es, any business that has productive activities in 2 or more countries, right? A multinational enterprise. So just 2, right? Just the United States and 1 other country, you qualify as an M&E. In the last 50 years, the rise of non-US multinationals and growth of mini multinationals has really has increased quite a bit since the 1960s. And non-US multinationals, their large number of multinationals reflect US economic dominance. And today's the world economy is shifting away from North America and Western Europe. So same message, a couple different ways to hear it in a couple different slides. So again, you'll see the largest national share of the largest 2,000 multinational corporations. Yes, the United States is still holding 29% here as of 2019. But again, China is catching up quick with already 15%. Japan has 11, etc. So no surprise, right, that Donald Trump was afraid that China might take over the world in many different ways. Okay, the changing nation of the M&E is continued here, the rise of the mini multinationals. So these are more small and medium-sized businesses. And I think this is important for so many of you because, yes, some of you will graduate and go to work now for Johnson & Johnson or PG&E, et cetera. But there are so many small and medium-sized businesses that now can do business overseas and really increase their revenues and income and et cetera by doing international trade and investment. The internet lowers barriers that smaller firms faced in the building of international sales. There's a changing world order. So the collapse of communism throughout Eastern Europe, greater export and investment opportunities, but political unrest is an increasing risk, right? So that we've also seen since 1989 when the Berlin Wall came down, that we have now more opportunities to sell goods and to import goods, et cetera, from Eastern Europe, Czechoslovakia, or the Czech Republic now, Yugoslavia, all the 5 different nations that make up that country, previous country, et cetera. But there is a lot of still political unrest in those areas. Serbia, et cetera, that people are a little bit hesitant to really jump with 2 feet into those worlds. Economic development in China, there's huge opportunities despite the continued government control, but also new competition from Chinese firms. So again, we'll talk about that again and again in this course. And free market reforms and democracy in Latin America, which we haven't touched on too much yet. So here there are new markets and new sources of material and production, but the economic and political risk remain really high, right? So as I said, there's huge corruption right now happening in Brazil. Venezuela has kind of bounced back and forth to a communist country. Mexico, right, with the guerrillas, and Colombia with the drug trafficking, et cetera. So those countries are moving forward, but people aren't jumping with 2 feet in to invest there because of some potential risk. There is a more integrated global economy, new opportunities for firms. Just to summarize, political and economic disruptions can upset plans, risks associated with global financial crisis, right? So like in any time of the world, there is always going to be ups and downs of the global markets. And there's also an impact of the global supply chain disruptions that we've seen now with COVID. So the best thing is hedging strategies are increasing in importance. And again, we'll talk about that later in this course. So that was the end of part 2 of 3. I'll go ahead and end this section. I will see you in part 3 if you're welcome in a few minutes. And if you're going to go ahead and play that video next. All right. Thanks.